Several weeks ago, I was flying home from Kenya when I got bumped up to business class on the flight. The guy seated next to me was named Max, and after we got settled in on the flight, he and I began to talk. I discovered that Max was a businessman who had worked all across Africa for the better part of 30 years, and during that time had been personally in most of the war zones that you and I have just read about or seen on television. He'd seen a lot of horrors that I'm glad I haven't seen. And they'd left a mark on him. Really, they'd left a scar on his soul, as was soon to become apparent when we began talking. Max told me that in his younger years he'd been pretty religious, but that because of all the awful things that he'd seen, he had become an atheist. You know how the conversation went from there. Max's view was if there really was a God, how could he let such awful things happen? And so he'd concluded there wasn't a God. Well, we talked about the fact that that's an understandable response to the horrible things he'd seen, but that there are some good answers to the question. And we talked about C.S. Lewis, one of his own countrymen who he'd never heard about, who a generation ago wrote some pretty good answers to the question, how can there be a God and still such awful things in the world? Well, at one point, Max opined that the world was really overpopulated. And he said that as heartless as it seemed, he felt like the advances of modern medical technology shouldn't be pushed out into the developing world so that we wouldn't be artificially keeping so many people alive. He felt that natural selection ought to be allowed to run its course and that would keep the world's population down. Made me kind of glad that Max and I weren't the only two people left on the planet. He was a lot bigger than I, and I know who would have won the survival of the fittest fight if it had come to that. But then Max began telling me about his kids, and particularly about his youngest daughter. He had adopted her in Kenya. He told me how it happened. He was at a hotel in Mombasa one day when he looked over to the swimming pool and there was a baby girl, little infant, face down, struggling in the pool. And so he reached in and grabbed up this little baby, and for the next 14 minutes performed CPR on the child until finally he got a cough in some response. At that point, he put the baby in his car, rushed to a hospital. The baby was in a coma for 3 days. After 3 days, the baby came out of the coma and miraculously had suffered no brain damage. Well, the mother of the child appeared at that point. She was a prostitute in Mombasa, and she told Max he could just have the baby. So Max brought his lawyer in, and he adopted that little girl, who's no longer a baby. He's the proud father of a beautiful young daughter who was born in Kenya and who almost drowned in a swimming pool. Well, not too many minutes after that, I looked at Max and I said, Max, you know what I like about you? I said, you're a philosophical atheist, but practically you're a softie. You look at little girls drowning in a swimming pool and don't conclude that natural selection is doing its thing. Instead, you grab up that little girl and you save her life, and when her mom wants to give her away, you take her and you make her your own daughter. We went from there into a really interesting conversation on where the idea comes from, if in fact there's no God, that little girls shouldn't drown in a pool, that you ought to rescue them and bring them into your home and into your heart. Where the idea comes from that the world ought to be different or could be different, if in fact it's just all evil and there isn't any God. Well, Max smiled and didn't answer the question, but he didn't need to. Sometimes it's enough just to ask the question. So we had a very interesting conversation. Before we got off the plane, Max gave me his email address and he said that he'd write me perhaps one of these days if he came back into the fold, to use his words. I'm guessing he will, because he's really a softie at heart. I don't think he really believes there isn't a God. I think that he's just really sad because he's seen so many horrible things. But in a pinch, Max loves. He loves. And in a world full of hatred and evil and the kinds of awful things that Max has seen all over Africa, he still loves. And as best I can tell, the only source of love is God himself. It was a reminder for me that the mission field doesn't start when I get off the plane at the other end of the journey. It might be at 36,000 feet somewhere along the way.